An officer's final request was to see his K9 one last time. What happened next stunned everyone. Officer Daniel Reed lay in his hospital bed, his once strong body ravaged by the relentless march of his terminal illness. As he stared at the sterile white ceiling, his mind drifted to the one constant in his life, his loyal K9 partner, Shadow. Together, they had faced countless dangers, forged an unbreakable bond, and served their community with unwavering dedication. Now, as Reed confronted his own mortality, he had only one final request: to see Shadow one last time. He longed to feel the comforting warmth of Shadow's fur, to gaze into those soulful eyes that had been his anchor through the darkest of times. With a heavy heart, Reed reached for the phone and dialed the precinct, hoping against hope that his wish would be granted. Captain Mason Cross sat at his desk, his steely gaze fixed on the stack of reports before him. As the commanding officer of the K9 unit, he prided himself on running a tight ship, adhering strictly to the rules and regulations that governed his department. When the phone rang, he answered with his usual brusque efficiency. Captain Cross speaking. The voice on the other end was weak, but the request was clear. Officer Daniel Reed, a decorated K9 handler, wanted to see his retired partner, Shadow, one last time before he succumbed to his illness. Cross's jaw tightened as he listened, his mind already formulating his response. "I'm sorry, Officer Reed," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "But you know the rules. Retired officers are not permitted to handle active K9 units. Shadow is still in service, and I can't make any exceptions." There was a moment of silence on the line, then a soft click as Reed hung up. Cross leaned back in his chair, his decision made. Rules were rules, and he would not bend them, not even for a dying man's final wish. Sergeant Emily Carter stood outside Captain Cross's office, her fists clenched at her sides. She had overheard the conversation, and the coldness of Cross's denial had struck her like a physical blow. Emily had been Reed's partner before his retirement, and she knew firsthand the depth of the bond between him and Shadow. As she walked back to her desk, Emily's mind raced with the injustice of it all. Reed had given his life to the force, had risked everything to keep the community safe, and now, in his final days, he was being denied the one thing that mattered most to him. She knew she couldn't let this stand, couldn't let Reed's last moments be tainted by the cruelty of a bureaucratic system that valued protocol over compassion. With a determined set to her jaw, Emily began to plan. She would find a way to reunite Reed and Shadow, no matter the cost. It was the least she could do for the man who had been her mentor, her friend, and her brother in blue. News of Reed's request and Cross's denial spread through the precinct like wildfire. Officers who had worked alongside Reed and witnessed the extraordinary bond between him and Shadow were outraged. They gathered in hushed circles, their voices low but their anger palpable. Among them was Officer Michael Chen, a young recruit who had been mentored by Reed in his early days on the force. He remembered the countless hours Reed had spent training him, the patience and wisdom he had shown as he guided Michael through the challenges of the job. Now, as he listened to his fellow officers express their frustration, Michael knew he had to act. He approached Emily, his eyes alight with determination. "Sergeant Carter," he said, his voice steady. "I want to help. Officer Reed means the world to me, and I can't stand by and watch him be denied his final wish. Whatever you're planning, I'm in." Emily looked at Michael, saw the resolve in his eyes, and nodded. "Thank you, Officer Chen," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We're going to need all the help we can get." As the days passed, Emily and Michael worked tirelessly to devise a plan. They knew they couldn't openly defy Captain Cross's orders, but they also knew they couldn't let Reed's request go unanswered. They reached out to other officers, both active and retired, who had worked with Reed and Shadow, and slowly, a quiet rebellion began to take shape. Officer Sarah Thompson, a veteran of the K9 unit, offered to take Shadow on an extended training exercise outside the city, providing the perfect cover for a reunion with Reed. Officer David Kim, who worked in the IT department, agreed to create a fake trail of paperwork to conceal their movements. And Officer Jessica Nguyen, a close friend of Reed's family, volunteered to coordinate with the hospital staff to ensure that the visit would remain a secret. As the pieces fell into place, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. They were risking everything, their careers, their reputations, even their freedom, but in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was giving Reed the peace and comfort he deserved in his final days. Captain Cross sat in his office, his eyes narrowed as he watched the activity in the precinct. Something was amiss, he could feel it in his bones. Officers were whispering in corners, exchanging furtive glances, and there was a palpable tension in the air. He called in his second-in-command, Lieutenant John Davis, and demanded an explanation. "What the hell is going on out there, Davis?" he growled, his voice low and menacing. Davis shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "I'm not sure, sir," he said, his voice wavering. "But I think it has something to do with Officer Reed's request." Cross's face darkened, his anger boiling over. "Reed's request?" he spat. "I thought I made myself clear on that matter. There will be no exceptions, no special treatment. If those officers can't respect the chain of command, then they have no place on this force." Davis nodded, his face pale. "Yes, sir. I'll look into it right away." As Davis scurried from the room, Cross leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew he had to act fast, had to quell this rebellion before it spiraled out of control. And he knew exactly where to start. Emily sat at her desk, her heart pounding as she reviewed the final details of the plan. In just a few hours, Officer Thompson would take Shadow on the training exercise, and Reed would finally be reunited with his beloved partner. Suddenly, the door to her office burst open, and Captain Cross stormed in, his face twisted with rage. "Sergeant Carter," he barked, his voice dripping with venom. "My office, now." Emily rose slowly, her shoulders squared, and followed Cross down the hallway. As they entered his office, he slammed the door behind them and turned to face her, his eyes blazing. "I know what you're planning," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "And I'm here to tell you that it stops now. If you go through with this, if you defy my direct orders, you can kiss your badge goodbye." Emily met his gaze, her own eyes flashing with defiance. "With all due respect, sir," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not going to stand by and watch a good man be denied his final wish. Officer Reed has given everything to this department, and he deserves better than this." Cross's face reddened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're treading on thin ice, Carter," he growled. "I won't tolerate insubordination, not from you, not from anyone." Emily took a step forward, her chin lifted. "Then I guess you'll have to do what you have to do, sir. But I won't back down, not this time. Officer Reed is going to see his dog, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." With that, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving a stunned and seething Captain Cross in her wake. Word of Emily's confrontation with Captain Cross spread quickly through the precinct. Officers who had been on the fence about joining the rebellion now rallied behind her, their resolve strengthened by her courage and determination. Michael watched in awe as the tide began to turn. Where once there had been fear and hesitation, now there was a sense of purpose, a united front against the cold and unyielding authority of Captain Cross. Even some of the older officers, the ones who had always toed the line and followed orders without question, began to speak out. They shared stories of Reed's kindness and compassion, of the countless times he had gone above and beyond the call of duty to help a fellow officer or a civilian in need. As the day of the reunion drew near, the precinct buzzed with nervous energy. Everyone knew the risks they were taking, the consequences they could face if their plan was discovered. But they also knew that they were doing the right thing, that they were honoring the legacy of a man who had given so much to their community. And so, with heavy hearts and steely determination, they prepared for the moment of truth. They knew that, no matter what happened, they would stand together, united in their love and respect for Officer Daniel Reed. The day of the reunion arrived, and the precinct was a hive of activity. Officers Thompson and Kim set out early, Shadow in tow, their destination a secluded park on the outskirts of the city. Officer Nguyen made her way to the hospital, her heart racing as she prepared to smuggle Reed out of his room and into a waiting car. Meanwhile, Emily and Michael remained at the precinct, their eyes glued to the clock as they waited for news. They knew that Captain Cross was watching them, his suspicion growing with every passing minute, but they refused to let their nerves show. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air grew thicker. Officers paced the hallways, their eyes darting nervously to the doors, waiting for the moment when everything would come crashing down. And then, just as the clock struck noon, the phone on Emily's desk rang. She picked it up, her heart in her throat, and listened as Officer Thompson's voice crackled over the line. "We did it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Shadow and Reed are together. It's beautiful." Emily closed her eyes, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. They had done it. Against all odds, they had given Reed the one thing he had wanted most in the world. But even as they celebrated their victory, they knew that the battle was far from over. Captain Cross would not take this lying down, and they would have to be ready for whatever came next. Captain Cross sat in his office, his eyes fixed on the security camera footage from the precinct. He had watched as Officer Thompson and Kim left with Shadow, had seen the furtive glances and hushed conversations between the other officers. He knew what they had done, knew that they had defied his direct orders and gone behind his back. And he was going to make them pay. With a growl of rage, he picked up the phone and dialed the number for Internal Affairs. "This is Captain Mason Cross," he said, his voice cold and hard. "I want to report a case of gross misconduct and insubordination within my precinct." As he spoke, his mind raced with the possibilities. He would see them all fired, stripped of their badges and their pensions. He would make an example of them, show the rest of the force what happened to those who dared to challenge his authority. But even as he plotted his revenge, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered to him. It reminded him of the look on Reed's face when he had denied his request, of the pain and despair he had seen in those eyes. For a moment, Cross hesitated. But then he shook his head, pushing the doubts aside. He was the captain, the one in charge. And he would not let anyone, not even a dying man, undermine his authority. Officer Daniel Reed lay in the grass, his head resting on Shadow's flank. The warm sun beat down on them, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees above. For the first time in months, Reed felt at peace. The pain of his illness, the fear of what was to come, all of it faded away in the presence of his beloved partner. Shadow, for his part, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. He lay perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Reed's face, as if he knew that this was a moment to be savored, a memory to be cherished. As they lay there, Reed's mind drifted back over the years they had spent together. He remembered the day he had first met Shadow, a scrawny, eager puppy with boundless energy and a heart full of love. He remembered the long hours of training, the endless drills and exercises that had forged their bond and made them a team. And he remembered the moments of triumph and tragedy, the times when they had faced down danger and come out the other side, battered but unbroken. As the sun began to set, Reed knew that it was time to say goodbye. With a heavy heart, he pulled himself to his feet and wrapped his arms around Shadow one last time. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." News of Reed and Shadow's reunion spread like wildfire through the precinct. Officers who had been too afraid to speak out before now came forward, their voices joining the chorus of support for their fallen comrade. Even some of the civilians they had served, the people whose lives they had touched over the years, began to rally behind them. They wrote letters, made phone calls, even staged small demonstrations outside the precinct, all in support of Officer Reed and his loyal partner. Captain Cross, for his part, was livid. He had expected his call to Internal Affairs to put an end to the rebellion, to crush the spirit of those who had defied him. But instead, it seemed to have only fanned the flames. As the days turned into weeks, Cross watched helplessly as his authority crumbled around him. Officers who had once jumped at his every command now looked at him with open contempt, their loyalty to Reed and to each other stronger than their fear of his retribution. And then, just when he thought things couldn't get any worse, the mayor's office got involved. Apparently, word of Reed's story had reached the highest levels of city government, and the powers that be were not happy with how Cross had handled the situation. In a closed-door meeting with the police commissioner and the head of internal affairs, Cross was given an ultimatum: resign quietly or face a very public and very messy investigation into his conduct. With a bitter curse, Cross signed the papers that ended his career. As he walked out of the precinct for the last time, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of regret. He had let his pride and his ego get the best of him, and in the end, it had cost him everything. Officer Daniel Reed passed away quietly in his sleep just 2 weeks after his reunion with Shadow. He was surrounded by his family and his fellow officers, the people who had loved him and supported him until the very end. His funeral was a somber affair, a sea of blue uniforms and black mourning bands. But even in their grief, the officers who had known him best couldn't help but smile at the sight of Shadow, sitting faithfully by his side, a silent sentinel to the end. In the days and weeks that followed, the precinct slowly began to yield. The young officers who had risked everything to give Reed his final wish were hailed as heroes, their courage and compassion an inspiration to all who knew them. Sergeant Emily Carter was promoted to lieutenant, her leadership and integrity recognized by the top brass. And Officer Michael Chen, the young recruit who had stood by her side through it all, became her new partner. Together, they worked to rebuild the trust and the camaraderie that had been lost under Captain Cross's reign. They reached out to the community, forging new bonds and strengthening old ones. And they made sure that the legacy of Officer Daniel Reed would never be forgotten. A year later, on the anniversary of Reed's passing, the precinct gathered once again to honor his memory. They planted a tree in the courtyard, a living memorial to a man who had touched so many lives. As they stood there, the sun shining down on their faces, Emily couldn't help but think back on all that had happened. The pain and the heartbreak, the courage and the sacrifice. It had all led them to this moment, to this place of healing and hope. She looked around at the faces of her fellow officers, at the civilians who had come to pay their respects. And she knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. For that was the true legacy of Officer Daniel Reed. Not just his bravery or his dedication, but his unwavering belief in the power of unity and the strength that came from standing together in the face of adversity. As the ceremony came to a close, Emily stepped forward and placed a hand on the trunk of the young tree. "Rest easy, Daniel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We'll take it from here." And with that, she turned and walked back into the precinct, ready to face whatever the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that she was not alone. As the years passed, the tree planted in Officer Daniel Reed's memory grew tall and strong, its branches reaching towards the sky like a symbol of hope and resilience. And just as the tree flourished, so too did the bonds between the officers of the precinct and the community they served. Under the leadership of Lieutenant Emily Carter, the department underwent a transformation. Gone were the days of cold authority and rigid protocol, replaced by a new era of compassion, understanding, and trust. Officers were encouraged to get to know the people on their beats, to listen to their concerns, and to work together to find solutions to the challenges they faced. Community outreach programs were established, bringing the police and the public together in a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect. And at the center of it all was Shadow, the loyal K-9 who had been by Officer Reed's side until the very end. After Reed's passing, Shadow had been retired from active duty, but he remained a beloved fixture at the precinct, a living reminder of the sacrifices that had been made and the bonds that had been forged. As the anniversary of Reed's passing approached once again, Emily knew that she wanted to do something special to honor his memory. And so, with the help of her fellow officers and the support of the community, she began to plan a grand celebration, a day of remembrance and renewal that would bring people together in a spirit of unity and hope. The day of the celebration dawned bright and clear, the sun shining down on the precinct like a benediction. From early in the morning, people began to gather, drawn by the promise of good food, live music, and the chance to come together as a community. There were booths set up around the courtyard, each one showcasing a different aspect of the department's work. There were demonstrations by the K-9 unit, exhibits on crime prevention and safety, and even a mock crime scene where children could learn about forensics and investigation. But the real centerpiece of the day was the memorial ceremony, a chance to remember Officer Daniel Reed and all those who had served and sacrificed in the line of duty. As the crowd gathered around the tree that had been planted in Reed's honor, Emily stepped forward to speak. "Today, we come together to remember a true hero," she began, her voice strong and clear. Officer Daniel Reed was a shining example of what it means to serve with honor, integrity, and compassion. He touched the lives of so many people, both within the department and out in the community, and his legacy will live on forever in the hearts of those who knew him. As she spoke, Emily could see the faces of her fellow officers, the men and women who had stood by her side through the darkest of times. She saw the tears in their eyes, the pride in their smiles, and she knew that they were all united in their love and respect for the fallen hero. And then, just as she was about to conclude her remarks, a hush fell over the crowd. From the back of the courtyard, a familiar figure was making its way forward, its tail wagging and its eyes bright with joy. It was Shadow, the loyal K9 who had been Reed's partner and friend. As he made his way through the crowd, people reached out to pet him, to offer him a kind word or a gentle touch. And when he finally reached the front of the ceremony, he sat down at Emily's feet, his head held high and his chest puffed out with pride. In that moment, Emily knew that Officer Daniel Reed's spirit lived on, not just in the tree that bore his name, but in the hearts and minds of all those who had been touched by his life and his legacy. And as she looked out at the sea of faces before her, she knew that, together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead, united in their love, their compassion, and their unwavering commitment to service. For that was the true meaning of community, the true essence of what it meant to be a part of something greater than oneself. And in that knowledge, Emily found the strength and the courage to carry on, to lead her department and her community into a brighter, more hopeful future. As the celebration drew to a close and the crowd began to disperse, Emily lingered for a moment by the memorial tree, her hand resting gently on its trunk. "Thank you, Daniel," she whispered, her voice soft and filled with emotion. "For everything." And with that, she turned and walked back into the precinct, Shadow by her side, ready to face whatever the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that they were not alone, that they were part of a family, a community, a brotherhood that would never be broken. Years turned into decades, and the precinct continued to thrive under the guidance of Lieutenant Emily Carter. As she grew older, Emily took on a new role, becoming a mentor to the younger officers who joined the force, passing down the lessons she had learned and the values she held dear. Among those young officers was Sarah Thompson, the granddaughter of Officer Michael Chen. From a young age, Sarah had been fascinated by her grandfather's stories of his time on the force, of the challenges he had faced and the bonds he had forged. As she listened to those stories, Sarah began to feel a calling, a deep-seated desire to follow in her grandfather's footsteps and serve her community. And so, when she came of age, she enrolled in the police academy, determined to make a difference in the world. From the moment she arrived at the precinct, Sarah knew that she had found her true home. She threw herself into her training with a passion and dedication that reminded Emily of a young Daniel Reed, and she quickly earned the respect and admiration of her fellow officers. As Sarah grew into her role, she began to take on more responsibility, leading investigations and community outreach programs of her own. And through it all, she never forgot the lessons she had learned from her grandfather and from Lieutenant Carter, the importance of compassion, integrity, and service above self. One day, as Sarah was out on patrol, she received a call about a disturbance at a local park. When she arrived on the scene, she found a group of teenagers gathered around a small, frightened puppy, trying to coax it out from under a bench. Sarah approached the group slowly, her hands held out in a gesture of peace. "Hey there," she said softly, crouching down to get a better look at the puppy. "What's going on here?" One of the teenagers, a boy with shaggy blonde hair and a nervous smile, stepped forward. "We found him hiding under the bench," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I think he's lost. We didn't know what to do." Sarah nodded, her heart melting at the sight of the frightened little creature. "You did the right thing by calling us," she said, reaching out to gently stroke the puppy's head. "We'll take it from here." As she scooped the puppy up into her arms, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu wash over her. There was something about the animal's big, soulful eyes and the way it clung to her that reminded her of the stories her grandfather had told her about Shadow, the loyal K-9 who had served by Officer Reed's side. In that moment, Sarah knew that she had found her own calling, her own way to carry on the legacy of those who had come before her. And as she looked down at the puppy in her arms, she knew that she would do whatever it took to keep it safe, to give it the love and care it deserved. As the puppy grew and thrived under Sarah's care, it became clear that it had a special gift, a natural aptitude for police work that was rare and precious. With Emily's blessing, Sarah began to train the dog, teaching it to track scents, to detect drugs and explosives, and to apprehend suspects with speed and precision. The dog, whom Sarah had named Raven, quickly became a beloved member of the precinct, a symbol of the enduring bond between the police and the community they served. Wherever Sarah went, Raven was by her side, a loyal and faithful partner in the never-ending fight against crime and injustice. Years passed, and Sarah rose through the ranks, eventually taking over as lieutenant when Emily retired. And through it all, Raven remained by her side, a constant reminder of the legacy she had inherited and the values she had sworn to uphold. One day, as Sarah and Raven were out on patrol, they received a call about a missing child, a young girl who had wandered away from her family during a picnic in the park. Without hesitation, Sarah and Raven sprang into action, combing the area with a sense of urgency and determination. For hours, they searched, their hearts pounding and their minds racing with worst-case scenarios. But just as the sun was beginning to set and hope was starting to fade, Raven caught a scent, a faint trace of the girl's shampoo carried on the breeze. With a bark of excitement, Raven took off, leading Sarah deep into the woods that bordered the park. They ran for what felt like miles, their lungs burning and their legs aching, until finally, they burst into a small clearing and saw the girl, huddled beneath a tree, her face streaked with tears. Sarah approached the girl slowly, speaking softly and calmly to reassure her that she was safe. And as she gathered the child into her arms, she felt a surge of emotion wash over her, a sense of gratitude and pride for the work that she and Raven had done. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of the missing girl's rescue spread throughout the community, a testament to the bravery and dedication of the officers who served and protected them. And at the center of it all was Sarah and Raven, a dynamic duo whose bond had been forged in the fires of adversity and whose legacy would endure for generations to come. As Sarah looked back on her life and her career, she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and wonder at the path she had taken. From a wide-eyed rookie to a seasoned lieutenant, she had faced countless challenges and overcome countless obstacles, always guided by the values and principles that had been instilled in her by those who had come before. And as she looked to the future, she knew that the work was far from over, that there would always be new challenges to face and new battles to fight. But with Raven by her side and the support of her fellow officers and the community she served, Sarah knew that she was ready for whatever lay ahead, ready to carry on the legacy of service and sacrifice that had defined her life and her calling. For in the end, that was what it was all about, the reason why she had chosen this path and dedicated herself to this cause. It was about making a difference, about leaving the world a little bit better than she had found it, one day and one case at a time. And as long as there were people like Sarah and dogs like Raven, as long as there were those willing to stand up and serve, to put the needs of others before their own, then there would always be hope, always be a chance for a brighter tomorrow.